Hello, welcome to my new video, and in this video I'm going to show you the game from 2019 between Richard Rapport and Jan Nepomniachtchi. We have opposite color bishops with heavy pieces on the board, with all heavy pieces, and I would say that white has a slight edge because of, first of all, better structure. Black has double pawns on the g-file. Light squares are a bit weaker in black's camp. For example, if you have this g5 pawn on h6, that weakness could be somehow neutralized, but also having this pawn structure slightly less flexible. Once you push these pawns on the king side, weaknesses become more apparent. On the other side, white has a fairly safe king. He can always play e3 to kick the bishop from attacking the f2 pawn. There's not much going on the king side for white. White's king is fairly safe, and we can say that because of the pawn structure and because of the king safety, slightly safer king, white is better. White just plays rook ac1 just to get the rook out of the way, and now he controls the c-file. First of all, black goes b4. He tries to somehow fix the king side to make the a2 pawn a backward pawn before he tries to contest for the c-file. Probably here, if you go rook c8, well, there's a small issue here because you can take, and there is small tactic here. Because the queen is not defended, you have rook d4. If you give a check, well, that's only one check, bishop f1, and you cannot capture because of queen e7. So it's not time to play rook c8 because of the bishop and the queen, which are quite unfortunate. Black tries other way to fix the pawn on a2 by b4, and now, like I said, you can kick the bishop by playing e3. Now the question is, where do you go with the bishop? If you go to c5, it's also safe, but does it do anything? The answer probably is it doesn't do anything, because you want to somehow have the purpose of that bishop. At least when you go to c3, as it was played in the game, you're blocking the c-file for the rook. If you go to c5 or b6, let's say to b6, the c-file is opened and the rook can always penetrate after, let's say, some exchange, or first going bishop f3 to stop, let's say, takes, at some point rook c6, but maybe not immediately because you might have some check, something like rook d2, so it's not very clear, but I think black's idea was really logical to go for bishop c3, to at least block this rook. The d-file is still ambiguous who is going to capture it, and that's why Rapport plays rook d3. He tries to double on the d-file, and he's using the fact that after capturing, taking now a6 pawn is under attack. But also it's quite questionable. You might even sacrifice the a6 pawn, let's say, do this, and white is a pawn up, but black also has the control over d-file. Unless you somehow push the a pawn and create a passer, you cannot really count on any advantage. So this was an interesting option to just give up the pawn and at least take over the d-file. Have at least some rook d2, queen f6 ideas to target f2, and I think that black would have decent compensation. Also, f5 was interesting in this position, to kick the queen away, and the only move is queen c4 because you want to keep the rook protected. And if king h7, then to go maybe rook cd1. Again, I think that queen a6 doesn't bring much to the table because after e4, you either go to d1, but it's a bit clumsy, or you go rook d8, but you still don't have the d-file. But at least white can play a4, using the fact that the bishop would be quite loose after ba. Quite loose. So, after a4, white at least has a passer on the a-file, and that a-pawn can be used as a decoy for black's piece. But in the game, Nepo played g6, tried to maybe get some king to g7 and then play f5. But this allows Rapport to double on the d-file, and finally you can see that white's control over d-file is undisputable, because if you take on d3 as black, then queen takes and you can never compete for the d-file. And that's maybe the downside of bishop c3, because bishop has one specific purpose in this position, and that's to close the c-file, but other than that, the bishop has no meaning. unless you want to defend the e5 pawn, which might be relevant. Other than that, the bishop on c3 is limited by b4 pawn, e5 pawn, e3 pawn as well, and it feels like a big pawn. In this position, Nepo took on d3, but maybe it was better to just wait by some move like king g7. You don't want to exchange rooks here. Even if you, by some miracle, take on a6, let's say queen c6, I think black has more than enough counterplay against the f2 pawn. Let's say this, queen c2, followed by bishop e1. I think even if you take like this, bishop e1 is just gonna be enough for some counterplay, and the extra pawn on this side is not gonna matter too much, because even if you push a pawn, which in this moment is not gonna be so easy because the b pawn becomes quite weak, even if you do that, even if by some miracle you don't capture on a3, take, after queen b1 I control b4 and it's not easy to push this pawn. Plus you always have to look after the king for some checks, and the bishop is never that safe. The king is never that safe. King g7, and let's say if white goes queen c4, then to capture, and maybe this was premature. And now Rapport took on d3. Here black can play queen f6 to just defend the pawn and maybe somehow hold this position. I think this was better. If he tries to attack by bishop f1, there is rook a8. And then follow it up with a5, a4 maybe. But Nepo plays king g7 here. And now a very nice move by white. His only problem in the position is the a2 pawn. So he's solving this problem by playing a4. The pawn on a4 is not backward anymore. And you may think that now the b3 pawn is weak. You may push the a pawn, but the b pawn stays quite weak. But with the light square bishop, you're able to defend the b3 pawn, while the pawn on a2 you can defend only by the bishop on b1, which is not so great. But if you put, let's say, the bishop on from g2 to c4, it can attack f7 and also defend the b3 pawn, so it's a perfect combination. For example, if you here took on a6, you would take the pawn, but black just plays rook d8, and probably this is something that Rapport didn't like in this position, to exchange rooks, and this would lead to some positions similar to what we saw previously. And here black would have a very, very good chance to survive, because now white has a tough choice. Does he want to surrender the d file to black, or does he want to exchange queens? If you take on d8, it's not easy to use the f7 pawn without heavy pieces. Even if you get bishop on c4, black can just defend it by his queen and still keep the a pawn backward by queen e7, defending against a3 or a4. This way I think black would have easier defense. But Rapport plays a4. Now he unbackwards his pawn on a2, and now he's ready to transfer his bishop to c4. Now Nepo plays queen f6. For example, if you try to go a5 to put all the pawns on the dark squares, now white can play queen d7. After this, the a pawn becomes a huge, huge weakness. Let's say if you take on d7 take, the plan will be next. You'll go bishop d5, bishop c4, rook a7, and then pick up the a5 pawn. Also, any source of counterplay for black is completely shut down, because the f7 pawn is under lots of pressure, and it's not possible to go for something like rook d8, rook d2, because it's way too slow. You lose the f7 pawn, and any counter chance against the f2 pawn, which is the only target, is impossible because of rook takes f7 and just defending the pawn on f2. This would be a big torture for black. So he played queen f6, and now Rapport doesn't play queen d6, he plays queen d7, tries to get his rook to d6. And now a5. What to do? Rook d6 was coming, and the a pawn was in big danger. And now bishop b4. In this position, trying to trap the queen by rook d6, because in the case of rook d6, immediately you have queen f5 and you might hold it. By bishop e4, in this position, you're cutting off the f5 square, and now the queen has to go away. And where to go? Well, I'm not so sure about this move, which was played by Nepo. He played queen e6, which makes the structure horrible. But what else to do? What else to do? If you go queen b6, you might go just rook d6, and then if queen c5, rook g6. And that's also quite bad. So maybe he just chose the lesser evil here, queen e6. But now Rapport is okay with exchanging queens, because at this moment the material is reduced, but you have these pawns which are quite bad and not very mobile, so it makes the bishop quite useless in this case. And first of all, Rapport does g4. He tries to lock down the king side to not allow the pawns to move, because you want to keep this bishop stable on e4. But also it's possible to just go king f1 here to get to e2, and also not be afraid of rook h8, because let's say if you go here, you don't have time for this. You can just lose the pawn on h2 without any problem and go for a5. Go for this and pick up a5 and continue this way. So after g4, Black plays king f6 and now rook d7. Now Black's king is in stalemate, but other pieces exist. And Nepomniachtchi played rook c8 here. He played this move, and it was possible to go rook f7 here. Not being afraid of exchange of rooks, because if you take it, and you cannot leave the king side alone, because the bishop is always going to come to e1 and get to f2. If you try something like this, Black can just wait, and when you get to d3, I have bishop e1. And this is just not gonna be enough for White. So if you escape by rook d6, well, you have bishop e1, and after this, bishop c3. Black is always annoying White with this attack on f2. And also he doesn't want to play f3 because of e3 pawn, which will be weakened. So maybe this was the moment for Black to do this, to just go for this rook f7 and to annoy the rook. But he played this, and now bishop d3, trying to get the bishop to c4 to target the e6 pawn. Also, it's possible to go rook d6 immediately, with the idea of bishop d5, but maybe he was afraid of king e7, and after rook a6, rook d8, and some counterplay by rook d2, or just bishop e1, rook d2, to attack the f2 pawn by this. But actually, if you take on a5, rook d1, king g2, rook d2, give a check, king d6, even if you allow capture on f2, the a pawn is just too fast, and after a6, bishop e1, White is gonna be okay with losing the f2 pawn, because the a pawn is just too far advanced. Also, you can do this, rook f7 and pick up on defend on f2 and start pushing until it's a queen. This is bishop d3, was played by Rapport, and now Nepo chose to free the bishop from c3, using that the bishop is not on e4 anymore, and now he gave up a pawn. Now the bishop on c3 pays a price for being free for one pawn. Bishop e4, now bishop comes out, bishop e5. Bishop did its job on c3 while rooks and queen were on the board, and now the bishop has to get a new place, because it needs to defend the a5 pawn, which is the crucial part of this position. Now Rapport does what he intended originally, bishop d3, and now rook c7. Black is not afraid of exchanging rooks here, because if you exchange, well, you're gonna just shuffle your bishop on this diagonal. Even if the king gets closer, you will always have one square available. If it's on c6, bishop has d8. If it's on d7, bishop has b6. And even though White has extra pawn, Black can always play e5 at some point and completely block the king side. In best case, White can just generate one passer, and that passer can be controlled by the king, while the a5 pawn and the whole queen side can be controlled by this bishop on c7. So it's not very critical. This is just a draw. So logically, Rapport just avoids this by rook d8. Now rook c1. And he has a very nice idea in mind. He's pinning this bishop and trying to force white to exchange rooks, which, as we saw previously, as I explained, leads to a draw. Now rook d7, cut the king, because, believe it or not, black would win the game. Maybe not win the game, but in case of some h3, he would have king e7, but this move was not the only move that saves the game. It's also this move, king f3, and in case of king e7, to go king e2. But let's go to the game. Rook d7 was the best move, just cutting out the king, and now rook d2. Black just keeps the rook on the d-file and tries to keep this pin alive. First Rapport plays h3 and now bishop b8, which I don't like so much. I think that bishop c3 again was much better, because a5 pawn is not the current issue for black, because this pin is much more valuable. What can white do here? If you go king f3, I'm wondering, can you go king e5 actually and try to stop king e4 and releasing the rook from d7? I think it's possible actually. This could be a good defensive technique, and if you try to play e4 here, well, I don't really feel that optimistic about it. You might have some king e3 next, but I think bishop d4 is just good enough, and after bishop e2 to go rook b2 and attack b3. So I think this was the good way to continue to maintain this pin. But I think that now after bishop b8, this was a huge mistake, and it just allows the king to kick out the rook on d2. Because if we see bishop c3, king f1 has no relevance at all. You cannot go king e1 because of some discovered check. So that's why bishop c3 was also quite powerful, because there's no way to kick this rook from d2. But Nepomniachtchi plays bishop b8, and now he's losing the support. After king f1, the rook is just kicked out from d2, and this means that the bishop can move. Bishop c4, bishop g1, and now you might think that black have some counter chance here, but now the e6 pawn is also lost. Bishop f2, king d1, white delays this by one move, and now bishop g1, rook e6, king g7, and now the e-pawn is a big factor in this position. Now rook h2, and losing the h-pawn is not very relevant, because the a-pawn is much more important, much more dangerous. That's why white pushes, doesn't spend any time on defending h3. Takes, rook e7, king f8, rook f7, and step by step the e-pawn got to e6. And now rook has to defend against e7, or bishop b5, e7, let's say, if you go some random move like bishop h2. Now there's this and e7. So that's why rook e3 is played, but it doesn't change much. King d2 was played, king d8, now rook f1, and now this connection is quite bad. Now black has to go rook g3, but now after one check, one more check, king d6, and now rook d7, trying to free the e-pawn. And after king c6, trying to stop e7, white does one last move, bishop d5. And after this move, Nepomniachtchi resigned, because after, let's say, king c5, white pushes the pawn, and after rook e3, trying to stop the e-pawn, there's bishop f7. After bishop f7, e8 queen is going to come next, and black is losing the rook. After this position, white improved this little by little, step by step. Of course, by some mistakes from Nepomniachtchi, white managed to get more and more pluses, I think the main mistake was bishop b8 in this position. I think bishop c3 would be more resilient, and it was the last mistake. Just keep this rook on d2. Once the rook got from d file, the bishop got free, and the e6 pawn became a much bigger target. In this position, bishop b8 was the decisive mistake. After bishop c3, black would have more chances to survive. And before that, I cannot really recall what... maybe even here, rook c1 was better, and after this to go rook d1 to somehow pin it. Or maybe here to go rook f7. It was never comfortable for black to defend this. Also in this position, after doubling on the d file, not to capture immediately but to play king g7, to wait for white to do something about it. If you have any questions about this game, just let me know in the comment section, and see you soon, and bye bye.